All right, today we're going to talk about land. Now, in my 23 years in real estate, I will say that the best investment I've seen is land, and the worst investment I've seen is land. In other words, investors can really make it or break it on a piece of land. And I've had so many questions throughout the years about property, a neighbor property, um, building a duplex, adding an ADU, and many of these questions result back down to the land that the real estate sits on. And furthermore, result down to the local municipality and their zoning code. So let's start with some terminology. Whenever someone approaches me about land in real estate, the first question I ask them is the land unimproved or is it approved? Now, let's talk about unimproved land. When you're driving, especially in rural areas, and you see real estate signs of land for sale, especially if you're driving south on I-15 or north up I-80, oftentimes what you're staring at is rural, unimproved land. That land may be zoned as agricultural, and it may be so unimproved that it does not have any utilities. It did not have zoning to build anything on it. And if you're unable to get things like water, power, and sewer to an unimproved piece of land, it can be rather valueless. So let's give some examples. Early in my career, we were looking at lots around Rockport Reservoir up in Colville. If you're traveling up I-80 and you go past Park City and you start going north, you'll get into Colville and Rockport Reservoir is up there. And at a time in the beginning of the Great Recession, there were lots around that reservoir selling for as low as $15,000. And people still weren't buying them. There were also lots in the same subdivision that were selling for over $100,000. And sometimes these $15,000 and $100,000 lots were right next to each other, and people couldn't make sense of it. Often when you see these types of situations, the difference is whether the lot is improved. If a lot has had what's called a percolation test, then you can put a septic tank on the property. If you can put a septic tank on the property, then you can have a toilet if you're going to build a house or a cabin. So as you see, you could have land right adjacent to each other, and one lot may be buildable for a residence, and another lot may not be. Let's go back to story time and do another example. Right now, in August of 2026, Breen Homes has a parade of homes at the mouth of Big Cottonwood Canyon. And the land that this home sits on, we have owned for almost a decade. And believe it or not, right there in Salt Lake City at the mouth of Big Cottonwood Canyon, we bought a couple acres for under $200,000. Now, if you hear that, you're going to think we got the deal of the century. But the reality is, over 2 decades, that land had transferred through many people's hands and nobody was able to get it buildable. Why? That land resides in Cottonwood Heights, and there was a lot of zoning code and issues that deemed that land not buildable. So, what kind of process did we go through, even though we got the land for so cheap, to actually build a home on that property? Well, the first thing you should know is it took 6 years. We owned that dirt for 6 years and we spent well over $100,000 in paperwork and reporting just to prove to Summit County that we could make it buildable per their zoning code. We also had to get what's called variances. We had to get 2 variances to build a home on that property, which the process of a variance can be very scary for people. You may own a piece of dirt and not know if you can build on it, and you have to go through city and or county approval to get it buildable. And that may require what we call in real estate a lot of papering. Papering refers to all the reports that the cities and counties are going to require for you to prove that the lot is buildable. And then if you come across something that per their code says it's not buildable, you then have to ask for a variance and go in front of the local planning commission, plead your case, and get that accepted. I will tell you in general, most speculative land where people are trying to get a zone change and multiple variances gets shut down. If I had to give you a percentage, I'd say these days a good 70% of the time, developers, speculators, investors are shut down on their plans for land if they need zone changes and variances. Let's go back up to the beginning where I said sometimes the best investment in real estate can be land and sometimes the worst. Now that we've talked variances, zone changes, I'll give some relative examples. A really, really good investment goes something like this. Perhaps one of the best examples is, say, a local home builder like Ivory Homes. They've created a lot of relationships with farmers. That farmland is often zoned agricultural. And when the farmer is finished with that land or somebody passes away in the family and they finally decide to sell, Ivory Homes will come in and take that agricultural land. However, all the adjacent properties may already be zoned for and have homes built on them. In those types of processes, Ivory Homes is pretty confident that they can go to the local planning commission and get the agricultural land rezoned as residential lots and then build homes. But it gets a lot more complicated than that. They are often having to give a lot of concessions. They may have to install a park. They've got to spend, depending on the size of the land, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, improving it. In fact, if I was to give you a rough number in Salt Lake City these days to improve a raw piece of dirt to be developed into a lot is going to cost somewhere between $100,000 and $200,000 to bring in roads, to bring in utilities. Now, that can change depending on the size of the parcel, how many lots. And the other thing that affects dirt a lot is topography. Topography refers to the slope, and the other topography issue is what we call geotechnical studies. If it is soft land, if it's soft dirt, if it's sand, if there's a high water table, if there's a lot of rock on the land, all of these things can wildly and drastically change your cost to improve that dirt. So, as we talk, you can see land gets extremely complicated. Let's also talk a little bit about zoning. I often get clients who are driving around and they'll call me or text me or email me and say, Jake, I was in the city and I just saw this vacant lot downtown. How much could I get that for? Could I build a high-rise condo complex? Every time I get these types of calls, the answer is it depends on zoning. And again, I know there's a lot of home run stories from back in the day where grandpa bought a piece of land for really cheap and then years later 10 times his money. Unfortunately, for the most part, those days are gone. Why? Cities now have master plans, and local cities or counties have overlaying master plans. What that means is, take Salt Lake City, for example. If you go down to State Street and go into the Salt Lake City Planning and Commission building, you can look at a future map of the master plan of Salt Lake City. And every single parcel in the entire city is already zoned as something. And that zoning tells you what you can do with that land. So, for example, if you're in the 9th and 9th district and you're in one of the neighborhood streets right now in Salt Lake City, that's zoned for a single family residence. And there's a relatively new zoning code over the last 3 or 4 years that could allow an ADU on the property. However, an ADU is an accessory dwelling unit, and it can be detached in the back of the property. Many people are converting garages to ADUs and making apartments or studios. But there's now specific code for the ADU, and it has to do with the size of the existing property, the size of the existing residence, and how close in proximity the ADU would be to the house, the width of the frontage of the property, the access and driveway, and parking. And you have to check all of those boxes to be able to put an ADU on your property in the 9th area. If you step right out of the residential street and you're right on 9th, as many of you know, that's full of restaurants and retail. And so those parcels are different zoning. Again, if you go into the planning and zoning department, they can tell you what is zoned for each parcel and what you can do. So the speculation is often taken out of it these days, especially in developed cities and counties. You're able to check a future master plan. You're able to know the zoning of each property. And let's go back to story time, our Parade of Homes home at the mouth of Big Cottonwood Canyon. We bought 2 acres right there, again, for under $200,000. But that land had major topography issues, major rock and slope issues, and we had to do a lot of reporting over a 6-year period to get that dirt deemed buildable. And when we went through that process with Cottonwood Heights, it was extremely onerous, very expensive. And to be honest, we were playing Russian roulette because we already owned the dirt. We were spending more money, over $100,000 on reporting, and we still didn't know if we could even build anything on it. That's why we got the land for so cheap. Initially, if you drive to that area, you will see that there are duplexes and townhomes on that exact street. So we tried to fight Cottonwood Heights, and let's see, what's the word for this? So we tried to fight Cottonwood Heights and get what's called proximity zoning. And our argument was there's already duplexes and townhomes on this street. And so we want our 2-acre parcel to be approved for 6 townhomes. And we fought that for a couple years and spent a lot of money trying to do that. And ultimately, after getting shut down many, many times, we finally relinquished as the developer, and we were able to get 2 residential building lots. We sold the lot to the north, we kept the lot to the south, and then we built the Parade of Homes home. It's really not that simple. It gets more complicated than that. But in short, if you really think about it, that 6-year process can be scary for people. And there's a couple other lots on that exact same street called Prospector Street, just east of Wasatch Boulevard. And we've had many calls from the owners of those lots asking how we were able to build a new home because they've owned their lot for years and not been able to go through the process. What most consumers don't understand is the time, energy, effort, money, and reporting that it costs to develop. So, am I discouraging you from developing land? No. You just need to be educated and know exactly what you're looking at. And that can be really hard for people. And, when it comes to, let's say, residential investment real estate, for the most part, when you're surfing on Zillow or Trulia and you're looking for a single family home residence or a condo that you could rent out or a vacation property, Airbnb, or perhaps your first duplex, yes, we would like to help you with those transactions and we're experts, but the math is typically pretty simple for people. They will say something like, here's a duplex, it's $800,000. My loan would be this much, my payment would be this much. Here's how much rent it brings in. And most people can run that math and guess about how well that investment will do for them. On land, it gets way more complicated. And I've found that people's numbers can be way off base. And for the most part, I've found that people get major, major sticker shock when it comes to their land. I've also found that you've got to look at how a lot of these investment properties are sold. Residential realtors are bound by a code of ethics. If they're members of the Salt Lake Board, they're required to uphold a code of ethics of honesty, and they can lose their license and or be sued if they are not upholding that code of ethics. Now, I'm not speaking ill of commercial brokers and other agents that are not members of the board, but those agents are not bound to a code of ethics. And so it's kind of the Wild West because most often these land parcels are listed by brokers that are not having to uphold code of ethics and or sellers that really don't know what they're selling. They may not know if their land is approved or unimproved. They may not know if it has utilities close or have any idea what it would cost to bring those utilities there. For example, our Parade of Homes home, one of the things we found out when we were spending 6 years to develop that property was that the main sewer line and water line was 160 feet up the road, and the city was going to require us to tear up the road, bring water and sewer down into the property, carry it beyond the property and connect it to the next adjacent property, and upgrade the old line, which used to be a 6-inch pipe, to an 8-inch iron pipe. Well, if you want to build a new home, you might just say yes to that. But what did that cost us? That alone added $78,000 to the cost of the build of that house. So there can be a lot of wild cards when it comes to dirt. And that's why you want to reach out to us. We're experts, and we can help you make an educated decision when it comes to buying your land.